Morning, Harold. It is June 6, 2002. I'm going to talk with Harold Kleinman today at his home, 11260 Leachman Drive in Dallas, Texas. And I'm Ruth Andrus. Harold, tell me, can you trace your family's arrival in the United States?
Yes, I can go back 3 generations.
Wonderful.
Including my own. Both my father's family and my mother's family came from Eastern Europe. They were in the mass immigrations that took place just before World War I. They did not meet in Europe, but came separately with their families and then met here in Dallas. Both came from the Poland-Russian area. We've never been quite sure where they were from, and neither spoke at all about their childhood, and I don't have much information about that. My mother's family came to Dallas, and with my grandmother and her second husband, her first husband having died in Europe, and there were several children, 4 with the first husband and 4 with the second. And they lived in South Dallas on Browder Street, and their name was Wolf, W-L-F, and a number of sisters and brothers, and they all grew up on Browder Street. My father's family came in 2 parts. One part ended up in Baltimore. The other part was diverted and came in Galveston, which is where my mother's family came, and ended up in Dallas. So my father's family is partially in Baltimore and partially here in Dallas. There were a number of those children as well, and they also lived in South Dallas, a little further south, I guess. They lived on Peabody. You can stop for a minute. We can edit this out.
What dates did you have? I was wondering. A minute.
What? You wait a minute.
When they came back. No.
Just go ahead. Both of my parents' families came in 1910 or 11, and as I said, in the great mass immigration that was taking place at that time. And all of my aunts and uncles were born in Europe. None were born here. And as I say, they all lived in South Dallas. My father was a young man, probably 15 or 16 years old. He was the educated person in his family. He had gone to the yeshiva and was quite well educated, both religiously and secularly. And I have books of his, science books and physics books and so forth in Yiddish that he used when he studied in Europe. He came here and, as did everyone else, got a horse and a wagon and peddled goods between here and Ferris and Ennis, and that's how he set out to make his living. It was really a terrible thing for him. He wasn't meant at all to be a businessman. He was a quiet, gentle, academic sort of a guy that was really out of place in the commercial world, but that's what happened. My mother worked, was really not educated in Europe at all, as I think was the custom. She and did not further her education here, but she, with her sisters, worked. They were from a rather poor family, and I remember that she did all sorts of things, but one thing that stands out in my mind is she worked at the Sears distribution center, and she said they worked on roller skates. When they got an order, they had a basket, and they would skate around and pick the order and fill it, and take it to where he wrapped it and sent it. And that was one of the jobs that she took. One of my aunts was a seamstress at Neiman Marcus, and another was a salesperson at Neiman Marcus. My uncles drifted around and chased oil wells. That's all on my mother's side, and just did what immigrants had to do at the time. They my parents met and married in 1920. About that time, my father left the horse and wagon and opened what we called a dry goods store on Elm Street, in the 2900 block of Elm Street. I believe that's where Deep Elm is now, and I suspect it's now a tattoo parlor or a restaurant or something. We looked up the address once and went to see it, and I believe it's now a restaurant. At any rate, it was a narrow front, long store. They lived in the back for a while, and then bought a house at 2925 Peabody, which is in South Dallas. It's a couple of blocks from the high school, from what was then Forest Avenue High, and another 3 or 4 blocks from to become the fairgrounds. And now on that particular location is where the Martin Luther King Center is located, between Forest Avenue and Peabody. That covers the property that was once our home. The store on Elm Street was a dry goods store, clothing for the whole family. My mother and father worked there, helped from time to time. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl in the 20s, both of whom unfortunately died at young ages. Well, the little girl was 3 and the little boy, I think, was 7 from pneumonia and appendicitis. It was a tragic thing, and from which they somehow went on, but I think never recovered. They then had a second family. My sister Shirley was born in 1928, and I was born in 1930. And of course, my first recollections are in our house on Peabody. My grandmother and 2 aunts lived across the street. That was my mother's family. My father's sister and her family lived a few blocks down the street. That's where I started my growing up. We were members of Sheriff Israel. I have recollections of attending services there, mostly playing outside while my parents were inside because I was quite young. And I have, recollections of the neighborhood and the people who lived there. My cousins, whose name was Siegel, that's on my father's side, had a pharmacy, the Colonial Pharmacy, there in South Dallas, and I remember going there and finding out what that was about. I remember going to our store, riding the streetcar. The means of transportation then was the streetcar, and we rode that to town that's where my father rode to go to work. My mother also worked in the store, and we always had some women in the house to help raise us. And I have some limited recollections of Peabody and the families around there, and the opening of the state fair, and a little bit about Dallas. But that was during the Depression, and in the late 30s, my father's business failed. And when I was 9 years old, we left Dallas and moved to a small town in West Texas called McCamey. So I just continue.
Well, yes, and continue.
You'll direct me.
Well, you're doing beautifully. You've answered all the questions I had to ask without asking.
I'll just ramble.
Perfect.
And
I was curious, did you tell us what congregation you went to when you were living on Peabody?
Yes, to Sheriff Israel.
Sheriff Israel. And did your parents participate in?
Yeah, my father was, as I indicated, quite trained religiously, and so he was a quite knowledgeable participant, and my mother was less trained as a woman, and at that time there was not much of a role for a woman. So the family was involved, yes. I have very little recollection because I said I was 9 when we left Dallas, so I just have an early recollection of that.
So you can't quite remember. Since you were playing outside, could you tell what the service was like when you were growing up there?
I don't really have a strong recollection of it. I truly don't.
Well, how did your family celebrate Jewish holidays here?
We were observant. My mother kept a kosher home, and we. Again, I just don't have strong recollections. I recall going to services, particularly on the high holy days. I went to Cheder, Heber Levine's Cheder. I remember there was a yellow bus that picked us up, and we rode around, and finally got to school and had Cheder. I remember other kids throwing rocks at the bus from time to time as we drove through the streets, and I remember learning elements of Hebrew as a child. And certainly we observed all the holidays that you would normally observe. And my family was an observant family.
What did the bus say on the outside?
It had Hebrew letters on it.
So that
And
was the reason.
I don't know. I mean, it was
Why you
obviously
got
a Jewish bus.
Yes.
And once in a while it raised some animosity, and we'd hear a clunk and a rock would hit it. But by and large, we were fine. And as I recall, the Cheder was in a home, in a house, and we were taught. I don't have a lot of recollection about that.
What kind of activities were you interested in as a teenager?
Well, I have to skip on. Then, as I said, when we were 9, my father's business failed on Elm, and we moved to a small town in West Texas, which was called McCamey. McCamey's in far west Texas, in the general area of Midland and Odessa, but not very close to anything. And it was an oil boom town in the 20s. Had a really in the 20s, in the early 30s, in its heyday, had a refinery and had 15 or 20,000 people, and just a great deal of activity. And one of my uncles, who was out chasing his fortune, happened to land there, and that's where he was living. So when my father's business failed, he arranged for us to move out to McCamey. This is my mother's brother. He arranged for us to move out there and buy the store that was owned at that time by some people named Steinberg, Jack Steinberg, who was from Dallas, and whose brother was in the dress manufacturing business, I believe. And Jack and his family were moving back to Dallas, and my family took over that store and moved to McCamey. So we just switched places with the Steinbergs, and there's a history about them. And they had a son here who, I guess Morris, who I guess has passed away perhaps. I believe he did. But at any rate, there's a connection there. My uncle was married to a non-Jew and had 2 children, and was really the only other Jewish person in McCamey. It was by the time we moved there, it was just before World War II, a town of about 2,500 or 3,000. It was primarily an oil town. Wooden sidewalks, hitching posts, narrow main street, mostly frame houses, one main street with a few buildings. And that's where my family went. And there was, looking back on it in hindsight, was a huge culture shock to them, and they really gave up a lot to go out there and try to make a living so that my sister and I could do something. And the more I reflect on it, the more I appreciate what they did.
Well, how long did you live there?
Anyway, well, I lived there for the rest of my schooling. I was 9 at that time. I started in the 4th grade. Went through the school. As the only, my sister and I and my 2 cousins were the only people that had any Jewish relationship. So we grew up there. It was a small school, 40 in my graduating class, and I just grew up in a small town. It was fabulous. I loved it. I was well treated. Never ran into any sort of problem. Participated in everything. Jewishly. 2 things happened. My father, who was an indicated educator, Jewishly continued the education of my sister and I, and he continued to teach us Hebrew. We read the Torah. We read it on Sunday because the store had to be open on Saturday. But he taught us our Parashah every Sunday, and he prepared me for my bar mitzvah, which occurred when I was 13 on Rosh Hashanah at the American Legion Hall in Odessa, Texas. And that was during World War II. And there was a military base in Odessa, between Odessa and Midland, as well as several Jewish families in that area. And as you know, all those little towns had 1 or 2 Jewish families in them. So while we were 30, 40, 50 miles from the nearest towns, there was 1 or 2 Jewish families, and they clustered. And our family went to a cluster that met in Odessa, And we met in the American Legion Hall and had high holy day services and other holiday services. And so that was where my bar mitzvah took place, which I read as taught by my father. And we had a little wine and cake when it was over. And that was a big event. I look back on those years with very mixed feelings. I'll tell this one anecdote because I think it really expresses. We used to ask my father on Sunday why we were having to do this study. Excuse me. While we were having to study Hebrew and study the Torah and so forth, and he would say, well, someday. Sorry. He would say, someday you'll understand. And of course, we didn't understand. We didn't understand, but now that I do, excuse me, sorry, now that I do, it's too late to thank him, but that was his commitment to the door of a door, and he carried it out, and now I do understand. At any rate, that's where I grew up, went through high school, got a good, solid education in a country high school, and was valedictorian of my graduating class, and I was the president of the senior class, and just a lot of stuff. Got some awards, and it was very nice, and it was time to do something, and at that time you did sort of what parents told you to, and what I was going to do was go to the University of Texas, which was fine with me since I'd never been anywhere. We graduated from high school. There were 40 in our class. We all cried, and we thought the end of the world had come because it was just great. It was just absolutely great growing up there. Yeah, it was. You talk about a village raising a child. Everybody knew you. Everybody took the time out to tell you what you were doing right or wrong. If they thought you weren't acting right, by the time you got home, your mother had heard about it by name, and it was just really wonderful. And so I went to the University of Texas. Finished school, went to the University of Texas. I was there about a week. It was really the first time I'd ever been anywhere, other than having come back and forth to Dallas with my father to markets. At that time, during the war, the merchants came to Dallas to the markets, and that's when the market center really developed here. Initially, as you know, the jobbers and everybody met in the hotels, at the Southland Hotel and the Dolphins and the Baker, and you walk the halls and try to buy goods for the store. So we would come in. So that was the scope of my travels. We never took vacations. We never did much. When I got to Austin, I was there, I guess, about a week or two, and I knew I was never going to go back to McCamey. The world just opened up, and I realized what was really out there. So I went to the University of Texas. I went to the business school. I went in for 3 years. Did well, and then my 4th year of business school, that was my first year of law school, and so then I went to law school for the 3 years. So I had 6 years at the University of Texas. I did well. Graduated second in my class, had the usual awards and so forth that go along with that. And that's when I met my wife, Ruth. She's from Houston. She started in school a couple of years after me. We met, were introduced by mutual friends, had a date, didn't date again for a year, had a second date. She remembered the first one. I'm not sure I did. But at any rate, we did start going together seriously, and right after I graduated from law school, we became engaged to be married. That was in 1954. The Korean War was still going on, and I entered the military service at that time as an enlisted man with a 2-year commitment. I was stationed first in El Paso. We had 6 weeks of basic training. We married in January of 1955 during my leave after basic training, and took our honeymoon by driving to my next assignment, which was in Baltimore, Maryland. It was new to both of us. As we were driving, we started seeing white out on the sides of the highway, and one of us commented, it's a funny time of year for them to be picking cotton, but the white kept getting thicker and thicker, and of course it was snow. And and by the time we got to Richmond, Virginia, the ground was covered with snow. It was beautiful. But we went to Baltimore. I was stationed at a place called Fort Harlowbird, which was actually it was a spy school. As I mentioned earlier, my father's family was from Baltimore, so my aunts and uncles and cousins all sort of took us in. We stayed initially in a little motel on the highway, but then because Ruthie couldn't find anything that looked decent, and I don't know if you've ever been to Baltimore, but Baltimore in the early 50s was not a real happy place. We moved in with some of our cousins, a young couple that had been married not much longer than we had, and they shared their flat with us, and became wonderful lifelong friends with them. And we were in Baltimore just a short time, and then I was transferred to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and Ruthie moved up there, and because I was on base and she couldn't live with me, she lived with her family. Her mother's family was in Baltimore, in Newark, and Barnes in New Jersey, so she lived with some cousins there, and I used to go in on the weekends, and that's how we handled New Jersey. And then from New Jersey we went to Fort Lee, Virginia, where we stayed a good length of time, and we had our own place there. Really the first time we'd had our own place. A lot of adventures there. Won't belabor them, but one of them was that I was assigned to the dental corps, being a lawyer, but I was assigned to the dental corps, and was there a month or two when the regular Army colonel, who was a dentist and in charge of that, found out I was a lawyer. He became infuriated, and not at me, but at the system, and that day took me literally by hand over to the staff judge advocate's office and had me transferred so that I could act as a lawyer rather than the dental technician, and he just couldn't get over how they had taken a lawyer and made him a dentist. But that was the Army. So I finished up there in the judge advocate's office doing legal work. Ruthie worked at the Medical College of Virginia. She's a bacteriologist, and she did work there. So she would commute to Richmond every day, and I would go to the Army in Petersburg, Virginia. And we stayed there almost a year and a half. Then we were transferred to San Antonio, to Fort Sam Houston, and stayed there a short time. My father died at that time, and my mother continued to live in McCamey. My sister also died about that same time. They died within a year of each other. So that left my mother pretty much stranded out in West Texas, and me still in the Army. It came time to get a job. Ruth was from Houston, and it was my first efforts were in Houston to find a job there. I went to a number of places without much result until one of the partners of one of the large firms there told me that frankly that I was not going to be able to get a job in a firm such as what I was looking at, because those firms didn't hire Jews, and that turned out to be the case. So I had an opportunity to come to Dallas, and one of my classmates from the University of Texas had come to work for Thompson and Knight, the firm that I joined, and had me come in and procured a job here. So when I got out of the service, Ruth and I moved to Dallas. It was interesting. That's probably the first and almost the last anti-Semitic event that's occurred in my whole life that I'm aware of. so directly and personally. But that was the situation at that time. Dallas was mixed. Some of the firms were open, some had quotas, and some were closed. But Houston, all the major firms were closed. And just as another aside, that situation continued just for a short time after that. And then Dean Page Keaton, who was the dean of the University of Texas Law School, called those firms together and told them that unless they stopped that policy, he was not going to permit them to recruit on the University of Texas campus. So and they did cease the practice. So to his credit, he broke that up in Houston. And my cousin from McCamey, my uncle's son, was one of the first Jewish boys. He was 5 years younger than me. First Jewish lawyers to be hired by one of those big firms in Houston. And he later became a very leading member of that very large firm. So those how those little threads run and those connections. Anyway, we ended up back in Dallas. We lived in an apartment over off of Lover's Lane. Ruth was pregnant with our first son at that time, and that's Bill, and he was born here in 1957 while we were still living there. Then we moved over here into this area, and we've been in this area ever since. Now, that gets me to Dallas with my family. We've then had a total of 5 boys. 4 are married. There are 10 grandchildren. Here I am working for Thompson Knight. What do you want me to do? Just keep going? Or
was Thompson Knight the only law firm? You stayed with that law firm?
Yes, that's the only firm I've ever worked for.
And are you now retired?
And I'm now retired, yes. Retired a couple of years ago.
Well, I know you've been involved in the Jewish community in so many ways, especially the Jewish Federation of Dallas, and of course the Temple Emanuel. Can you tell us about involvement in these organizations as well as the others?
Yeah. Be glad to. The law firm I joined, Thompson & Knight, was at the time a large law firm. That's the 50s. It had 23 lawyers. It now has over 300. But one of the positive things about that firm was that its members had always been heavily involved in community activities, and it encouraged and gave you time to do those things. So I was able to take advantage of that and direct some of my efforts into community activities. And coupled with that is my wife Ruth, who I have to give credit for. She really is the heart side of our family, and her commitment and encouragement and direction had everything to do with my being able to get involved in some of the things that I got involved in, her support. So that coincidence of home and business that enabled me to do those things did let me get involved in a lot of things. And I have over the years been involved in a number of activities, both really professionally and in the general community and in the Jewish community. You want me just to talk about some of them?
Yes, that would be very interesting.
Professionally, for what it's worth, I'll touch that briefly. I did a number of things. I was fortunate to have a great career opportunity with my firm in its growth and in the nature of its clients and its business. And I did become the managing partner of that firm and was managing partner for 12 or 15 years, which was a great honor. During which time a lot was done. I was active in bar activities and professional activities, and held a number of positions in the state bar and became chairman of the corporation banking and business law section of the bar, which is a large section in which lawyers in that field operated, and that's one of several things that I got involved with. One of the best things I got involved with is the creation of what was called the Equal Access to Justice program in Texas. That was a program that generated funds to help indigent people in civil cases, not criminal matters. The criminal cases were handled through court appointments and so forth, but to enable people without funds to access the civil system, and that could be marital work or business work or housing, just anything. It was very difficult, and the federal government finally established a legal services project which furnished some of that help, but the states started adopting programs, and I was one of the people that initially got involved in the state of Texas. We tried to get it established by our state legislature, and the politics prevented that. There still are, but at that time were heavy groups, primarily business groups, who really didn't want poor people to have that kind of representation. There were landlords who didn't want tenants to assert their rights as tenants. There were creditors who didn't want the poor people to understand what it meant to be a debtor. And so we couldn't get that through the legislature, but we had a far-sighted Supreme Court at that time, and so they declared it. The Supreme Court declared it and made lawyers eligible for it. And that organization was called the Texas Equal Access to Justice Foundation, and it was designed to raise monies, and has raised millions and millions of dollars, and still exists and raises $8 or $10 million a year now. And I was the first chairman, and I was the chairman of that for several years, and that's something as to which I'm quite proud, because I think that's a lasting contribution to making our legal system available to more people. So that's kind of a touching on the professional side. In the general community, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of things, and many things have come along, but a couple of them I've spent a lot of time in the United Way and come up through the ranks there, and I've been chairman of the board of the United Way, which was a peak of that particular activity, and something that I'm very proud of. Became involved with something called the Center for Nonprofit Management, which is a management organization that furnishes services to not-for-profits. It teaches them to operate better, and I became president of that organization and have acted as its president. And I've served on the boards of various community organizations, and currently I'm on the board of Green Hill School. It's really my second time. I was on it once with one of my sons, Green Hill School.
No, it's mentioned.
Once with one of the sons, and now I'm on it in connection with one of my grandchildren. Mm-hmm. Well, there are 4 grandchildren there, but I'm on that board now, and I'm also, have for many years, several years, been involved in the board of Methodist Hospitals of Dallas, which is a 2-hospital system here. Not well known, but actually quite extensive. And I'm the chairman-elect, and will be chairman of the board of Methodist Hospitals starting next year. So those are just some of the things in that area, but I'll focus now really because of where we are on some of the Jewish activities. I guess I've touched one way or another so many of the organizations here, and have been on the board of a lot of the Jewish organizations. The Family Service, the Home, the JCC, not any of the Jewish schools. I have been involved with Temple Emanuel. When we first came to Dallas, Ruth and I joined Sheriff Israel because her family is a conservative background in Houston, and my family was a conservative background, so that was the natural place for us to join. And it was fine, but the course of events, including where you had to sit at High Holy Days, if you could only afford the kind of a ticket we could afford, and some of their attitudes about women and bothered us. Other things bothered us, and on the other hand, at Temple, Levi and just a superior elect was there, and we became attracted to Temple. And after a few years, we moved our main activities over to Temple Emanuel, that would probably be, we came to Dallas in 56. Yeah, 56, so that would be in the late 50s. We continued our membership at Sheriff Israel, actually, over the years, but it became more or less a contribution because our activities really focused at Temple Emanuel. So anyway, we ended up at Temple, and became active there, as did Ruth, and over the years I got involved with and became president of their brotherhood, and then I got on the Temple board and various committees, and ultimately became president of the Temple, and was president for 2 years, which was a great activity. You know, a lot happened in that period of time. The new Temple had been built when we came to Dallas. It was already opened, I think, in the early 50s. So all of our activities at Temple were at the current location on Hillcrest and Northwest Highway, not in the earlier locations. And during that time, we, you know, had Levi and Jerry, and then we had the issues of other rabbis that came and went, and difficulties that emerged during that, and I was heavily involved in the difficulties that existed when both Jack Bemperat and Jerry Klein were trying to act as co-rabbis. My own feeling on that is that we made a terrible error, we being the Temple and its board, of which I was a member. We didn't have a clear direction. Jerry thought that he was entitled to be a rabbi. Levi didn't designate a successor. Jerry thought he was entitled to be the successor. Nobody told him otherwise. Some hired Jack Bemperat and told him he was going to be the head guy. We took two good people. We brought out the worst in both of them, and it was our fault. And we just darn near run both of them. Maybe we did run both of them. I don't know. But it was a terrible decision because of the indecision of not picking one and saying you're it and going forward. But anyway, we worked our way through that. I was on the search committee that brought Shelley Zimmerman here. And that was chaired by Henry Slinger and Shirley Pollock, who did just a fabulous job. And that was good. And then I was on the search committee that ultimately hired David Stern to be our current chief rabbi. And I'm on the search committee now to look for a cantor, which is another exciting activity that's going on at Temple Emanuel. So although my presidency is over, I'm still involved in a number of things. I've also became heavily involved in the Jewish Federation. Maury Newberger is the person who got me interested in that and got me involved in various activities, which I worked my way through, and ultimately became the president of the Federation. And feel that you know, we did some good things. I know that some things I'm proud of is in working with Ann Sikora, a wonderful person. We co-chaired the drives to raise money in some of the emergency activities that were necessary. And in 1 year, we, in a special drive, raised $5 or $6 million, working with Ann and obviously the whole community, but very proud of that. Ann was a great leader and did a lot for the Federation, as she did for everything she touched, and it was really a pleasure to have that opportunity. But anyway, worked my way through the Federation, and I'm still a little bit active in it, not a lot, but I am involved in the community building campaign that's going on now, and I'm co-chair of the what they call the validation committee of that effort. And that's 10 Jewish organizations trying to raise money in a combined capital campaign. And the committee that I'm involved in looks at the requests of those organizations and tries to make certain that there is a community need for what they want to raise money for, and that the scope of what they want to do is reasonable. That is, that it fits, and that there's viability there. That is, that if the money is used for those capital purposes, that the organization can viably continue, have the funds to operate and so forth. So we're involved in that, as is the Historical Society. So that's part of the activity. That's a thumbnail. Let me stop and see what we need to fill in.
Would you like to just tell us, I know you've seen many changes in the Dallas community. Would you like to comment on this? You've been here since '56.
Right. Well, of course, people have been here multiple generations, so they've seen a lot more change than I have. But the fact is, there has been a great deal of change. There's been obviously, on a macro basis, societal changes, economic changes, community changes, world changes, all of which affected Dallas, just like it affected everywhere. So I'll kind of focus on the Jewish part of it, if that's okay. I'd say several things. One I'd say is the literal growth in number of Jews in Dallas and their origins. Let's start with that. I think when we first arrived, most people here were born here. There had been an influx after World War II of people who came to Dallas, so that was here. A lot of them servicemen who were stationed here or in the South and who liked it, so came from the East or from the colder areas. And the urbanization of the country was really just beginning. So there were already people who had moved in and come to Dallas, but still the community was quite small and clearly led by and totally influenced by people who had been here, almost as founding families. They go back into the late 1800s or certainly the early 1900s. All the merchants, politicians, the professionals were old and established people, and then they really ran the community and did it very well. There was a huge influx of people from all over the country. The country was wide open. Economic times were good. People could come here. There was room for everybody. You could succeed. So there was a huge inflow of professionals, business people, visionaries, everything. And so that changed the nature of the community. It increased the influence of Jews in the community, which is always strong here, but it increased that. It multiplied geometrically the number of Jewish organizations. The congregations initially just got bigger. The ones that were here just got bigger, but then got proliferated into multiples that we have today of congregations and public relations and service organizations and schools, so forth. That all grew. So I'd say one of the big changes was just the number of Jewish people here and the growth of organizations that they associated with. Another big change, I think, was the change in attitudes that growth brought with it. Dallas, as I saw it, was a pretty assimilated community. And there were Jewish organizations and synagogues and so forth, but the Jewish people melted in pretty much with everybody else. And as the community grew, as there were more and more Jews, there was more and more association with each other. There's a sort of a second level arose where a lot of people's contacts were mostly with other Jewish people as opposed with just other people generally. And I think there was a sort of a resegregation almost of Jews. It's of some. Others that were totally assimilated. And we ran into what I thought was an interesting dichotomy. You had simultaneously Jews who were either getting on the periphery or uncommitted or leaving Judaism, or certainly children and so forth were leaving Judaism. And simultaneously, other Jews were becoming more and more committed to their Judaism, or Judaism as they saw it. A lot of it just ritual, but anyway, whatever they were doing, and resegregating themselves. And so you had people going off in both directions. And I think maybe that's happening all over the country. I don't know, but I see it here. And so it's always been amusing to me to see that simultaneously you'd have both of those things going on at the same time, and you see it even within families, where one set goes one direction, one set goes the other, and leaving less in the middle, where I have always planted myself and where I feel most comfortable. I've never felt so good about being on the extreme anywhere. My own judgment is that about if you can stay in about the middle 90% of anything, and off the 10% periphery, everything will work just fine. And that most of the problems or the issues and so forth are caused by the 10% that are on the periphery. And so I've always planted myself in the middle. Now the problem with that is that it's that 10% that are the visionaries and the great artists and the great professionals and the troublemakers and the disaffected. So you don't want to really trim them off, because if you do, you'll find yourself stagnant and lost. But so you got to have those people. They're important, but they're usually not happy, because they are working against the tide, and so I admire those people who have those talents, but since I'm not one of them, I seldom join them on the edge out there. But anyway, be that as it may, I see those things going on. I see the attitudes of the Jewish community changing greatly. I think this teaching of tzedakah and charity was so deeply ingrained in my parents and in my observation of their peers, survived only partially in my generation and is weakened even more in the next generation. I think the pressures of the living and opportunities and so forth have distracted people from thinking of others, and that there is just less of a willingness to devote themselves to thinking about and helping others, and more of a tendency of those who do care simply to write a check rather than become personally involved. And unfortunately, even more of a tendency of them not even to write the check or to make it minimal and non-priority, so that the community has a harder and harder time to address issues of those who are in need and deal with them. And wish we could find a way to re-attract people into giving of themselves, or at least of their resources, to help others. But I see that moving another way. Maybe we've just worn people out by asking for too much. I don't know. And I don't want to generalize, because obviously we have very, very dedicated and wonderful young people who are totally committed to the same ideals, or even more so than all of us had. But I think their numbers, relative numbers, are shrinking.
You have so many projects and things to be proud of. Could you narrow it to one thing that you're most proud of?
I don't know. I never articulated it, but I always thought in about 4 spheres as to how I'd like my life conducted, and one and the paramount was my family. And so I guess if I think I'm most proud of is my family. I'm terribly proud and dedicated to Ruth. She's just outstanding, and as I say, she should be sitting here. She gets the credit because she's the heart of this operation. She's just a terrific, wonderful, sensitive, intelligent person, and has been encouraging to me, and has really helped me think clearly on so many things. So I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud of our children and our daughter-in-laws and grandchildren and family. We've been fortunate to have a nice family, and hopefully they're all doing okay, and are in their own way have some commitments, which I hope will show up. Some have shown up already, and more so than others, but they're all committed, and I think that maybe we've transferred some of our commitment to them. So family is one. Professionally, I'm very proud of the association that I've been fortunate enough to make with my law firm, which really has been outstanding, and in which I was treated so fairly and wonderfully, and I'm very appreciative of that. And I'm proud of having been involved in the development of this organization that I mentioned earlier, that basically helps poor people access the legal system. I think that was a long-lasting accomplishment of which I'm very proud. So that's professionally. In the community, I'm proud of both my Jewish and my non-Jewish activities. I've just been lucky enough to have been able to get involved in a lot of things. Of course, over 50 or 60 years, there's time to get involved in a lot of things. But you know, I like everything I've done. There are very few things that I haven't enjoyed and appreciated. Some I felt I've done a little bit more than in others. But it's hard to choose. It's hard to choose. But I'm pleased that I've been able to do some of the things that my parents imbued me with, and maybe done some things that had they been able, they would have done themselves. I'm happy about that. And so, you know, I don't know. I'm pretty happy with things.
That's wonderful.
I'm still worried about my kids and grandkids, and I'm still worried about the world, and I'm still worried about poor people. And I look back and wonder, after all this time of flaying the air, whether we're really any better off for all the effort that's gone into social issues, whether we're any better off today than we were 50 years ago. I don't know that a single issue that's, when I reflect on it, that we're any better off. Maybe seniors are better off. I think women certainly are better off in the sense of their rightful place and recognition. I think minorities are as well. But in both instances, we've got so much more to do, and we're still so far behind that I'm troubled. I think we're just on the road. We're at a tape. We'll stop talking.
One last question. You certainly have contributed so much to making a better world. Could you possibly tell us who are your role models?
Well, you know, certainly my father and mother, and Ruthie. I have focused on people in the community that have influenced me. I've always, you know, I don't know why I had an affinity to people like Murray Mundus, for example, or Erwin Donsky, Bernie Shannon, and Fanny. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Jake Feldman, or Julia Sheps, or Fred Florence, but those are names that are role models to me. There are people who, God bless you, who, you know, did very well from an economic standpoint, but didn't let that distract them at all from caring about others and stepping up and doing what it took to make it right, and doing so in not grudgingly, but actively. And so when they asked you to join them, there was no way to tell them no. And there's a whole cadre of people of that generation that I've always admired, because they've taken the good fortune that they had and tried to share it, and tried to lead, and never sought any kind of personal aggrandation or anything else. Their satisfaction was just seeing it done. They had great optimism. They were the great optimists. They were, you know, they came out of World War II with no way to go but up, and that was always their goal. It's just that we can always do better, and their optimism has always influenced me. And so they've been role models. teachers have been role models who not teachers of narrow specifics, but teachers of the great scope of the world and what's in it, and to open your eyes and look and see and gather in all that you can, and urge others to look even bigger and broader and enjoy and appreciate the wonders that we have. People like that have influenced me, because I think it is just such a wonderful place that it's just a shame that so many people, for personal reasons or because they have to, or have to shut that out and become narrow and limited, and then want to draw others in with them and close the doors all around them. I've always thought what a shame that was, and I don't want to get off where I shouldn't be here, but it's always to me be a shame that people close their vision or narrow their vision, and then try to narrow the visions of others to some cause or attitude that shuts out the rest of the world. So I've always admired people like that.
Well, the Dallas Jewish Historical Society really thanks you, Harold, for sharing your time and your life with us today. Thanks again.
A photograph of Ruth and I, and our 5 sons and 4 daughter-in-laws and 10 grandchildren, taken in a park here in Dallas.
And let's take this picture here.
This one?
Mm-hmm. On the top.
This is a picture that's of my 5 sons at an early age. That's in the white jacket is Bill, and then to the left sitting down is Lee, to his right is Mark, and then the second one sitting down is Jay, and then that's Max in the front on the tricycle.
Okay.
And
This, the bottom picture.
And then this is, of course, a later picture of Ruth and I and our 5 sons, Bill, Lee, Mark, Jay, and Max,
Good.
taken in our home.
Let me go back up to the top one more time. Just make it clear. Okay.
Okay?
Yep.